The Nile, the world's longest river. A 7,000-kilometer lifeline for almost 400 million people. Flowing north, the Nile runs through 10 countries, from the highlands in the heart of Africa to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. A source of sustenance, but also one of tension, even potential conflict. The Nile is the key to a geopolitical rivalry in the region. At its heart is Egypt, where suspicions about former enemies and tensions with an age-old civilization reveal deep-seated fears about water scarcity and losing control of the River Nile. Ethiopia. The Blue Nile flows on its long journey towards Sudan and Egypt. The Ethiopians call the Blue Nile the Abai, a word carrying a sense of reverence and adoration.
The name of Abai is big, father. It's a fatherly, the resource that provides, that is very heavy, very respected, revered from Ethiopian side.
Ajibench Abibi lives in the village of Zom Amba, close to the Abai, or Blue Nile. With a family of 9 to support, Ajibench collects firewood, the sole source of energy.
We don't have electricity. My hair has turned from black to grey living in this land. We just burn this wood and some kerosene for light during the night.
For Ajibench, like more than 80% of Ethiopians, the very thought of a light bulb is a dream.
I will celebrate. I don't know when I'm meant to die. But for so long I've been burning wood, and if I get light with just a click, I will die a happy person.
The Nile could help realize the dreams of Ethiopians like Ajibench. Harnessing the fast-flowing river, descending from the Ethiopian highlands, would generate electricity, reducing the country's chronic power shortage. But to date, the full potential of the river remains untapped. Decades of civil unrest and war have hindered Ethiopia's ability to develop. Instead, it remains one of the world's poorest countries. Meles Zenawi assumed power in 1991. He champions himself as the builder of a new Ethiopia. Billboards around the capital, Addis Ababa, herald a brighter future, with the construction of dams and hydroelectric power stations. The projects will, quite literally, bring power to the people.
One of the big resources we have in Ethiopia is hydro. So the government has an intention to develop up to 10,000 megawatts within the coming 5 years.
Beneath these hills is the Tana Beles hydropower station. This tunnel will divert the Nile waters over turbines to generate power. The station will eventually produce over 400 megawatts of electricity annually, reducing Ethiopia's power deficit by 30%. The water exits from tunnels to continue on its way downstream. No water is taken out of the river, a point the Ethiopians are particularly keen to stress.
So now what we are doing here is we are diverting that water. So we are not changing anything of any operation of the lake or the river.
The Tana Bele station does not affect the Nile's discharge. This is the crucial factor. Egyptians say they would regard any attempt to reduce the Nile flow to their country as a hostile act. So, Ethiopia treads a fine line between exploiting the Nile for its own development while not incurring the wrath of its downstream Nile neighbors.
We are here to develop dams not to reduce or not to damage their needs. We are going to utilize for our economic development as well, because Ethiopia is a poor country, now trying to come out from that poverty by utilizing its resources. Nile is one of our resources.
Despite Ethiopian assurances, Egypt is concerned about any reduction in its sole source of water. A 1929 agreement between Egypt and Britain, the colonial power at the time, gave Egypt a veto power on any project upstream that would affect or decrease the amount of water reaching Egypt. Egyptians are keen to ensure this agreement is upheld.
Egypt needs to manage the river's discharge. The agreement states there must be prior notification. This must be adhered to. According to international laws governing the use of rivers running through many countries, upstream states can use the waters on the condition they don't harm the downstream countries. You are obliged to notify me, to notify Egypt, so my interests are not harmed. You can satisfy your interests, but just don't harm mine.
But Egyptian interests were challenged.
Your Excellencies, here with me is the agreement on the Nile River Basin Cooperative Framework.
In May 2010, at a meeting of Nile Basin countries in the Ugandan city of Entebbe, 6 upstream states, including Ethiopia, signed a new Nile agreement. The agreement enables upstream countries to implement irrigation and hydropower projects without Egypt being able to exercise the veto power it was given by the 1929 agreement.
Egypt will not be able to stop Ethiopia from building dams on the Nile. That is history, and that is not going to be part of the solution. Ethiopia is able and willing to use its own resources to build dams on the Nile. The way forward is not for Egypt to try and stop the unstoppable.
The prospect of upstream countries building dams alarms Egyptians, especially if that country happens to be Ethiopia. Only 15% of the Nile waters reaching Egypt originate in the Great Lakes region. Yet, 85% come from the Ethiopian highlands, from 3 main tributaries, the Sabat, Blue Nile, and the Atbara. Any dam built in Ethiopia would pose a serious threat to Egypt's water supply. The likelihood of such a scenario is creating tension between the 2 countries.
The transparency and consultation was not happening between the 2 countries, might be because of suspicion, because of some unknown fear, I think. But this unknown fear can only be from the Egyptians, because the water is coming from here, from Ethiopia.
Such antagonism is exacerbated by a long history of rivalry. Egypt, the land of the pyramids and the ancient civilization of the pharaohs. Ethiopia, a land described as the birthplace of mankind, and the domain of great emperors who ruled a country for centuries. Acrimony between these two civilizations has always been centered on the Nile. The rivalry dates back some 3,000 years to the times of Ethiopian Emperor Menelik I.
Emperor Menelik I of Ethiopia used to threaten Egypt, saying that he would divert the course of the Nile to the Red Sea, away from the Mediterranean. These threats were made, and all the rulers of Egypt, from the time of the pharaohs, used to send gifts and gold to the emperor to stop him from diverting the Nile.
Religious differences have added to the historical tensions. In the 4th century, Ethiopia became a Christian nation, making it one of the oldest Christian states in the world. From the 7th century, Egypt emerged as the heart of the Arab and Islamic world. As the two countries adopted different faiths, power politics over the Nile continued down through history.
By the time Muhammad Ali began to rule Egypt in 1805, many threats had been made by the Ethiopian emperors to stop the water reaching Egypt. Most were just empty threats, but some were valid. Every time there was a new ruler in Egypt, they would threaten him and blackmail him so that he paid gold to the Ethiopian emperor. Muhammad Ali considered how to eliminate this threat, which was damaging to Egypt's prestige.
Muhammad Ali's response was to expand Egypt's borders southwards to command the headwaters of the Nile. In 1820, he conquered the territories, today known as Sudan. For the first time, Egyptians and Ethiopians were now face to face across a common border. In the 1870s, Muhammad Ali's grandson, Khedive Ismail, continued his grandfather's expansionist policy, seeking to increase the size of his realm over the course of the Nile.
Khedive Ismail tried to conquer Ethiopia. He dispatched a large army. He thought it would be an easy mission, but he failed. The Egyptian army was crushed in 1876 and had to retreat.
The rivalry between Egypt and Ethiopia continued into the next century. By the 1950s, it had taken on a more personal dimension. Despite the smiles and handshakes, the two countries were led by two larger-than-life leaders with two differing political visions. Egypt's president, Jamal Abdel Nasser, was a revolutionary ideologue of anti-imperialism. Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie was a monarch embodying imperial governance. Both men saw themselves as Africa's primary leader.
There's been a lot written on Ethiopia because it's a country with a great civilization, like Egypt. And so there was always a feeling that it was equal to Egypt. But Egypt was always more important. Ethiopians never had the same role.
In 1959, Egypt and Sudan agreed on dividing the river's waters. Ethiopia was neither invited to the negotiations nor included in the agreement.
That Ethiopia was not included was a big mistake. But Ethiopia made it sure that, having also known that such a deal was going on, and Ethiopia was very much opposed to that exclusionist policy.
In the 1970s, political changes in each country raised tensions further. Egypt's new president, Anwar Sadat, abandoned both the leftist ideas of his predecessor and relations with the Soviet Union. Instead, he turned to the West. Egypt's new political leaning was endorsed by an official visit from US President Richard Nixon, who received a rapturous welcome in Cairo in June 1974. Ironically, a few months later, Ethiopia would go through a political turnaround of its own. In September 1974, Emperor Haile Selassie was overthrown in a military coup which turned Ethiopia into a communist country. The two countries were right back where they started, in a political standoff on different sides of the Cold War. Once again, the River Nile was at the center of this tension.
Egypt's relations with the Soviet Union deteriorated. The Soviets, in coordination with Ethiopia, responded by planning to build dams in the Ethiopian highlands to stop or decrease the Nile water flowing to Egypt. President Sadat answered back, saying Egypt would launch a war and destroy any dams built on the Ethiopian plateau that affected the amount of water reaching Egypt.
Today, the Ethiopians continue, for the time being, to tread the fine line between developing their country and deferring to Egyptian concerns. But this could change. In April 2011, Ethiopian Prime Minister Meles Zenawi announced plans for a new project on the Blue Nile. Called the Grand Millennium Dam, it is forecast to produce over 5,000 megawatts of electricity per year. It will be the largest hydropower station in Africa and will solve Ethiopia's chronic power shortage. Ethiopia is aware of Egyptian concerns.
The Ethiopian people and the government is not enemy of Egypt and Egypt's people. So what we are demanding is really to see on equitable basis, as the Egyptian government and the politicians are caring for their people and their lives, they have to care also for Ethiopia, as we are already caring for them also.
As populations increase and economies develop, demand for the Nile waters is intensifying. The Nile may be the world's longest river, but it carries a relatively small amount of water compared to other rivers around the world.
The Nile's annual discharge totals 84 billion cubic meters. This is insufficient for any of the Nile Basin countries. As for Egypt, it's simply not enough. Egypt's need for water is growing greater day by day.
The scarcity of water in the Nile Basin is creating fear, suspicion, and tension. Such sentiments are exacerbated by the uncertainties of Mother Nature. The Nile is formed from rainfall at its points of origin in the Ethiopian highlands and the Great Lakes region. The gift of nature is proving increasingly erratic.
Right now, with the climate change, the weather forecast is unpredictable. Even the so-called rains which we used to have in plenty, it is now no longer regular, it's no longer predictable.
Well, I'd say that with higher temperatures, you obviously have the potential warmer air, holds more moisture, you have the potential for bigger downpours. So if that does prove to be the case, then further flooding will be an issue. But there is only a limited amount of water out there in the atmosphere, so flooding in one area will inevitably lead to drought in another.
Averting such catastrophe will require cool heads, calm words, and regional collaboration. Following the revolution in Egypt in early 2011, Egyptian diplomacy was refocused on the region.
We need to cooperate, and they need to cooperate. We want to continue in a mood of consensus, not conflict. Because all the Nile Basin countries are here to stay. No one is going anywhere.
There is no basis for fear against each other. There is no reason to fight. And there is no reason that one country monopolizes the water resources, whether in the upstream or downstream.
From the Great Lakes of East Africa and the highlands of Ethiopia, through the swamps of the Sud, the arid desert of the Sahara, the fertile valley in Sudan and Egypt, flowing out into the Mediterranean Sea. Millions living along the River Nile dream of a better future.
Ni binadamu kama sisi tu, lakini kitu cha Mungu.
It is a natural resource.
Kwa njia nzuri vile tule.
It is a gift from God.
Na watu walianza.
And we must all use it well. Just like our forefathers.
Serikali iko na akili nyingi sana kushinda hata sisi.
No one living beside the Nile can ever stray from it. If he does, he will feel lost.
I've lived long enough. I dream of a better future for my kids.
God is sustaining us. God provides. Everything is good. God's blessing is all around us.
As long as there is no war and we are living in peace, we sleep easy.
I want to continue with my job. I do like it very much, not this big, but this big.
The River Nile unites worlds of mountains, jungle, marsh, and desert. But in the man-made world of nation-states, asserting patriotism and politics, the river has become a source of discord. The Nile Basin countries face a stark choice. Set aside fears and tensions and cooperate, or run the risk of confrontation and conflict. The Nile will endure, but a continuing struggle over its waters can only spell ruin for all those who live on the banks of this great river.